It is September 1945, Seletar Airfield, Singapore. The monsoon heat presses down on cracked concrete runways still pockmarked from 3 years of bombing. Scattered across the grass and the hardstands sit the broken remains of an air force that no longer exists. Japanese seaplanes, their wings drooping, their fuselages streaked with rust and jungle mildew. Imagine walking through rows of these machines, their propellers bent, their cockpits open to the rain, insignia of the rising sun still faintly visible beneath layers of grime. British airmen from a unit with an unglamorous name, 126 Repair and Salvage Unit, Royal Air Force, move among the wreckage with clipboards and cutting torches. Some machines they tag for shipment, others they simply walk past, leaving them to rot where they sit. In one photograph from this exact moment, 2 young airmen lean casually against a Mitsubishi F-1M2 float plane, an aircraft the Allies codenamed Pete, as if it were nothing more than scrap furniture in a forgotten warehouse. But it was not nothing. Weeks earlier, these same aircraft had been instruments of Imperial Japan's air power across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Now they sat abandoned, half sunk in mud, waiting for a decision that would determine whether they became museum pieces, foreign Air Force assets, or twisted scrap metal fed into a furnace. The war was over, but a new mystery was just beginning. What really happened to Britain's haul of captured Japanese seaplanes after the guns fell silent at Seletar? To understand why this moment mattered, you have to understand what these aircraft represented. Japanese float planes like the Mitsubishi F-1M2 Pete and the Aichi E-13A Jake were the eyes of the Imperial Japanese Navy. They flew reconnaissance missions from cruisers and seaplane tenders across thousands of miles of ocean, spotted Allied convoys, directed naval gunfire, and in the war's final desperate months, some were even converted into makeshift kamikaze aircraft. Over 1,000 E-13A Jake seaplanes alone rolled off Japanese production lines during the war, making it the most numerous float plane in the entire Imperial Japanese Navy. By 1945, dozens of these aircraft were scattered across Japanese-occupied Malaya and Singapore, based at facilities like Seletar itself, which the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service had used as a training and operations hub since 1942. When Japan surrendered in August of that year, none of these aircraft simply vanished. Every single one became a problem that someone in a British uniform now had to solve. The first days after the surrender were chaos wrapped in bureaucracy. On the 8th of September 1945, Vice Admiral Kogure of the Imperial Japanese Navy formally signed over Seletar Airfield to British forces, a ceremony captured in grainy photographs that still exist today. In this rare photo, we see stiff-backed RAF officers watching in silence as their former enemy hands over control of the very airfield his aircraft had once operated from. But signing a document did not answer the practical question sitting on the runway. What do you do with dozens of enemy aircraft, many of them still fueled, some of them booby-trapped, all of them sitting exposed to tropical weather that could destroy them within weeks? This is where 126 Repair and Salvage Unit entered the story. Their job was not glamorous. It was inventory, recovery and disposal, the unglamorous plumbing work of victory. Imagine the scene at Seletar in those first weeks. Trucks rumble across the airfield, engines straining under the weight of dismantled aircraft sections. Airmen use flatbed lorries to haul in captured float planes recovered, not just from Singapore itself, but from far-flung outposts. One Aichi E-13A Jake, loaded onto a truck at Seletar, had actually been captured at Rabaul, on the island of New Guinea, hundreds of miles away, and shipped back to Singapore for processing. The scale of the salvage operation was staggering, and the men doing the work were engineers and mechanics, not historians. They were not thinking about legacy. They were thinking about logistics. There was looting, in a sense, though not the kind involving personal enrichment. Souvenir hunting ran rampant. Instrument panels vanished into kit bags. Rising sun insignia were pried from fuselages as trophies. Meanwhile, official teams stripped aircraft for intelligence value, removing engines, radios, and armament for examination long before anyone considered whether the airframes themselves were worth keeping. And there was rust. Singapore's humidity is merciless, and within weeks of sitting exposed on the tarmac, aluminum skins began to corrode, rubber seals perished, and standing rainwater pooled inside fuselages that had once carried Japanese naval aircrew across the Pacific. The clock was already ticking before anyone in London had even decided what these machines were worth. The fate of Britain's captured Japanese seaplanes unfolded in 3 distinct phases, and the first was brutally simple: destruction. Most of what sat at Seletar in late 1945 was never going anywhere except the scrapyard. There was no budget, no shipping capacity, and frankly no appetite in post-war Britain for preserving enemy war machines when the country itself was rationing bread. Row after row of aircraft that had once been feared across the Pacific were instead reduced to piles of twisted aluminum, their engines pulled for scrap value, their airframes cut apart with torches and left to be hauled away. Picture the scrapyards that sprang up around Southeast Asian airfields in this period. Mountains of aircraft parts, propeller blades stacked like firewood, wings sawed in half to fit onto transport trucks. This was the fate of the overwhelming majority of Japan's wartime aircraft, not just at Seletar but across the entire collapsed empire. Historians estimate that of the roughly 1,000 assorted Japanese aircraft still sitting in former occupied territories at war's end, the vast majority were scrapped locally rather than preserved. But scrapping was not the whole story. A second phase involved something far more selective: evaluation and reuse. Britain, like the United States, understood that Japanese aircraft technology held genuine intelligence value. A joint RAF and American unit called the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit for Southeast Asia, a TAIU-SEA for short, had been formed years earlier specifically to study captured Japanese aircraft, and by early 1946 this unit had gathered roughly 64 Japanese Army and Navy aircraft at Singapore, the majority of them still in flyable condition, earmarked for shipment back to the United Kingdom. This is where the story gets stranger than most viewers expect. Some of these captured aircraft were not flown by British pilots at all. In an almost unbelievable arrangement, several Japanese naval aviators, men who had been fighting the Allies mere months earlier, were kept on at facilities near Seletar specifically to fly and evaluate their own former aircraft, operating under the close supervision of RAF officers. Imagine the scene: a defeated Japanese pilot climbing back into the cockpit of a Mitsubishi fighter, this time with British officers standing on the tarmac watching his every move, extracting knowledge from the very men who had used these machines against them weeks before. Some aircraft even received fresh coats of paint and new Allied roundels, flying test missions from airstrips like Tebrau in British Malaya under the ATAIU-SEA banner. These were not friendly training flights. They were intelligence-gathering missions designed to understand exactly how Japanese engineering had kept pace, or fallen behind, during 4 years of brutal war. The plan had been to ship all 64 of these evaluated aircraft back to Britain for museum display and further study. Reality intervened. Shipping space in the immediate post-war period was desperately scarce, consumed instead by returning troops, repatriated prisoners of war, and urgent civilian cargo. An aircraft, however historically significant, was low priority when soldiers were still waiting to go home. The result was heartbreaking for anyone who cares about aviation history. Of those 64 carefully preserved and evaluated Japanese aircraft, only a small handful, reportedly around 4, actually made the journey across the ocean to England. The rest, aircraft that had survived combat, capture, and careful technical evaluation, were ultimately scrapped anyway, victims not of enemy action, but of post-war shipping logistics. This brings us to the third and rarest phase of this story, the survivors. The machines that against overwhelming odds escaped both the scrapyard and the ocean crossing that claimed so many others. Consider the ICE-13A Jake seaplane captured at Rabaul and processed through Seletar by 126 Repair and Salvage Unit. This particular aircraft did not go to Britain and did not go to the scrapyard. Instead, it passed into the hands of the Royal New Zealand Air Force, which flew it briefly from a station at Jacquinot Bay in New Guinea. Its ending was quiet, rather than dramatic. A month after arriving, one of its floats was damaged. The aircraft was deemed not worth repairing, and it simply sank at its moorings, disappearing beneath the water where it likely remains to this day, a Japanese naval aircraft resting on the seabed of a bay in New Guinea, forgotten by almost everyone. Then there is the story of the Mitsubishi Ki-46, a reconnaissance aircraft captured near the Malayan Peninsula in September 1945 and handed over without propellers, seemingly stripped deliberately by its Japanese crew before surrender. British engineers spent months restoring it to airworthy condition, and by early 1946 it flew into Seletar itself to receive fresh British markings before eventually being shipped to the United Kingdom. That aircraft survives today, one of the extremely rare Japanese wartime aircraft still in existence, now housed at the Royal Air Force Museum in England, a direct physical link back to that runway in Singapore. Here are the details most documentaries never mention, the strange footnotes that reveal just how chaotic this period truly was. First, there were two distinct waves of what pilots at the time called Green Cross flights. Immediately after Japan's surrender, Japanese aircraft were required to display large green crosses instead of their military insignia, marking them as surrendering rather than hostile. The first wave of these flights ran from roughly the 19th of August through the 12th of September 1945, carrying surrender delegations and ferrying aircraft to Allied assembly points. A second wave continued through mid-October, delivering final surrender orders to isolated outlying Japanese garrisons who had not yet received word the war was over. Some Japanese aircrew were still flying combat-marked aircraft weeks after Japan's formal surrender, simply because news had not reached them. Second, some captured Japanese aircraft ended up living almost comically anticlimactic afterlives compared to their wartime service. A machine designed to spot Allied warships across the vast Pacific might spend its final months as a training curiosity for bored technicians, or worse, as a source of spare aluminum for entirely unrelated projects. The gap between what these aircraft once meant and how casually they were eventually discarded is jarring. Third, and perhaps most striking, is just how few of these aircraft survive anywhere in the world today. Of the enormous numbers of Japanese naval and army aircraft that existed at the moment of surrender, only a tiny fraction survive in any form, and the aircraft associated with Seletar and Singapore represent an even smaller sliver of that already tiny fraction. The Royal Air Force Museum's collection at Cosford, built substantially around aircraft shipped out of Southeast Asia during this exact period, remains one of the only places on Earth where the public can stand in front of a physical piece of this story. So where are they today? The seaplanes that 126 Repair and Salvage Unit processed and dumped at Seletar in 1945. Most exist nowhere at all except in photographs, having been cut apart, melted down, and repurposed into the raw material of a rebuilding post-war Southeast Asia. Their aluminum may well have ended up in civilian goods, in construction, in 1,000 mundane objects that nobody would ever connect back to a Japanese Navy float plane. A handful exist as wrecks beneath the water, like that ICE-13A resting at the bottom of Jacquinot Bay, a piece of aviation history slowly dissolving in salt water, visited by nothing but fish and the occasional curious diver who has no idea what they are looking at. An even smaller handful survive as museum pieces carefully restored, painted and placed behind ropes in England, silent witnesses to a war that ended nearly a century ago, their Japanese origins and British post-war markings both preserved as layers of the same object's history. And Seletar Airfield itself still exists today, transformed almost beyond recognition into a civilian aerospace hub in modern Singapore, its wartime runways buried under decades of redevelopment. Walk across that ground today, and there is nothing to suggest that in 1945 this exact patch of earth held the scattered, rusting remains of an enemy air force, or that a small British repair unit stood among those wrecks deciding, almost casually, which pieces of history would survive and which would simply be dumped, forgotten, and left to dissolve into the tropical rain. These machines were built to spy, to strike, and to serve an empire that no longer exists. In the end, their fate was decided not by admirals or generals, but by tired young mechanics with clipboards, making quiet, unglamorous choices in the humid aftermath of a war that had already consumed everything else. What they chose to save and what they chose to abandon is the closest thing we have left to understanding how an entire world tried to move on from total war, one discarded aircraft at a time.